Halo Effect by Alex51324. Chapter 2. Within a few days, everyone seemed to forget about Thomas's involvement in the Pamuk affair, helped along no doubt by Carson's quelling glares whenever anyone dared allude to the Turkish gentleman's existence. Thomas wasn't sure whether to be annoyed that he was getting no more appreciation for his heroism, or relieved that they were done accusing him of planning to blab about it. The only one who continued to try to pry the story out of him was Miss O'Brien, who apparently hadn't been successful in getting it out of her ladyship. But he'd held firm, and there was a decided coolness between them as a result. Then a traveling fair came to the village, and that took up everyone's conversation. He'd been one of the first to get to work on convincing Carson to let them go and see it. Anything for a change of scenery. But when he spoke to Miss O'Brien about it, she sniffed and said she wasn't interested in rustic amusements. Thomas was still trying to decide whether he ought to be above it as well, when William started going around trying to find out if Daisy was going. He noticed a tendency in William to get pink and tongue-tied when Daisy was in earshot, which promised a certain amount of added entertainment value if Daisy was in fact going. Finally, Bates suggested the simple expedient of asking her. Thomas felt a stab of jealous outrage, not of either of them in particular. William ranked barely above Daisy as an object of erotic interest, but that he could simply ask her in front of everyone, and with Bates's approval and encouragement to boot. The next time Daisy wandered in from the kitchen, William began blushing and stammering. So, Daisy, I was wondering... It would put William in his place, Thomas thought, if he swooped in and asked Daisy himself while William was still trying to get the words out. She fancied the pants off him, and had since she'd come to the house. She'd forget William even existed if Thomas put himself in the picture. There's the fair, in the village, William went on. Of course he knew. Everyone in the bloody house knew. And a few of us were thinking of going. Daisy looked at him with an expression of polite puzzlement. It might be a bit fun, Something a little different, like. I mean, it's several of us going. Unable to stand it any longer, Thomas told William, You're making a spectacle of yourself. And over a bloody kitchen maid. While Bates made a disapproving noise, Daisy turned to Thomas, her attention suddenly riveted, so he explained, What he's trying to say is that he'd like you to go along so he can make cow eyes at you and maybe try to get up the gumption to think about holding your hand. Is that true? She asked William. Blushing even harder, William nodded. Looking back at Thomas, Daisy asked, Are you going? Bravo, Daisy, Thomas thought. That's how you do it. But he wasn't about to encourage her out loud. It was irritating enough to have her mooning about silently. He shrugged idly. I might. I don't suppose there's anything wrong in William taking you, as long as it's a mixed group going. To William, Daisy said, I suppose it's all right, as long as Miss Patmore sees in the same way? Once they'd gone to find out, Bates said to Thomas, I'm not sure if I ought to thank you or punch you in the mouth. His tone was almost admiring. Thomas shrugged again. Just putting all of us out of his misery. Besides, it's better she sets a cap for someone closer to her own level. Bates shook his head. And now I am sure. Later, after they'd taken the coffee up to the drawing room, Carson summoned Thomas into his pantry.
I heard that William intends to escort Daisy to the fair, and that you encouraged this.
Bloody hell, saying that Bates had started it wouldn't help. Carson didn't like tattletales any more than he liked people usurping his authority.
All I said was that if we were going in a mixed group, I didn't see any harm. I hope he didn't think that meant he didn't have to ask you.
Carson looked at him.
You understand that in a great house the virtue of the female staff must be above reproach, and so must the conduct of the male staff.
Of course. It was on the tip of his tongue to point out that he was perfectly capable of dragging William off Daisy if he took it into his head to ravish her behind the coconut shy, but realized just in time that it might be taken as a coarse reference to the earlier incident.
Very well,
Carson said.
as long as you keep watch that they stay with the group and if Anna or another of the responsible girls is going.
Thomas wanted to protest being held responsible for William's wooing, but the mention of Anna suggested a certain parallelism, the head housemaid and first footman keeping an eye on the younger ones. Also, he was a little surprised and pleased at being considered in the light of a guardian of feminine virtue.
Certainly, Mr. Carson.
Anna was slipping into her place at the servants' hall table when Thomas came up behind her and said lazily,
Mr. Carson wants us to keep an eye on the two lovebirds if you're planning on going this evening.
Across the table, she eyed Mr. Bates. She'd mentioned the fair to him a few times, hoping he'd say that he was going and they could look around it together, but he'd been non-committal. She could hardly be as obvious as Daisy and ask him point blank just when another man had mentioned it, even if that man was Thomas. Instead, speaking a little more loudly than Thomas had, she said, "Are you asking me to go round the fair with you?"
She wasn't entirely sure which of them she hoped to fluster, Thomas or Mr. Bates, but either way it didn't work. She ought to have known better. Feminine wiles never worked out for her. Mr. Bates remained impassive, while Thomas just answered silkily,
"Only if you don't want to spoil it for the children."
William glared at Thomas across the table,
but Daisy, coming in with the bread, seemed oblivious to the insult. "Oh, please say you'll go. Miss Patmore will surely let me if you're going." "Don't worry, Daisy," she told Daisy. "I'm planning to go." After dinner, they all went upstairs to change. Anna made a point of helping Daisy fix her hair into something a little less dowdy. It would take more time than they had to do anything about her dress, but the poor girl deserved a little glamour in her life. "It's all right that you're going with Thomas," she said abruptly as Anna was putting in hairpins. "I know he'd never be interested in the likes of me." "Well, you're right about that," Anna murmured. More loudly, she continued, "We're not really going together. I was just teasing. William's a lot nicer anyway." "But Thomas is so elegant," Daisy said wistfully. "Beauty is as beauty does, as my mum used to say," Anna told her. "And there, you look beautiful." She held up the mirror so Daisy could look. "I'll never be beautiful," Daisy answered, "but my hair does look nice. Thank you ever so." It had taken the men less time to get changed, and they were sitting at the servants' hall table when Anna and Daisy went down. William's face lit up at the sight of Daisy, transformed from a dowdy kitchen maid into a slightly less dowdy fairgoer. Fortunately, he also remained seated, fidgeting with his cap, while Thomas, sprawled languidly across a chair, got up and stabbed out his cigarette with a flourish. He was already on the way to the cupboard to fetch Anna's coat by the time William had managed to find his way to his feet. Turning on the charm, Thomas helped her into her coat as if she were one of the ladies upstairs. After a moment, William got the picture and galumphed off to get Daisy's. Much as Mr. Bates had suggested earlier, it was honestly hard to tell if he thought he was helping, demonstrating to William how to go about walking out with a girl, or showing off to make William look all the plainer and more awkward by comparison. It occurred to her that he might not even be sure himself. It might, she realized as they walked arm in arm down to the village, keeping a few paces back from William and Daisy, even have been a little cruel of her, pretending that she thought he was really asking her. It wasn't as though he could ask anyone he was really interested in, or walk arm in arm with him. He kept up the game when they reached the fair, treating her to a lemonade and solicitously asking what she'd like to see first, when William would have dragged poor Daisy over to look at the battled freaks, whether she wanted to see them or not. "Let's walk round and have a look at everything before we decide what we want to spend our pennies on," she suggested. William had the sense to look to Daisy for approval of this plan, and at her nod, they set off. The fair didn't take long to walk round. It wasn't a large one, consisting mainly of food stalls and games offering prizes that could be bought for less than it cost to play for them. Daisy's first choice of an attraction was to visit the menagerie. A board out front had pictures of all sorts of beasts that could never have fit inside the small tent. A majestic elephant, snarling tiger, fierce gorilla, but none of them argued, and Thomas and William shelled out the price of admission. Inside was more or less what Anna had expected. a moth-eaten camel chewing its cud with a faraway look, 2 monkeys huddled together in a cage, a number of brightly colored birds. But Daisy seemed as enchanted as if they were the marvels the sign had promised, dragging William by the arm from one exhibit to the next and exclaiming at what she saw. "I always feel a little sorry for them," Thomas said as they looked at a sleeping panther, ribs showing through its dull black coat. She looked up at him a little surprised. Who'd have imagined Thomas feeling sorry for anyone except maybe himself? "It's hardly where they belong, is it?" he asked a little defensively.
"No," she said, taking his arm. "I suppose it isn't."
She suggested the swinging boats next. There was nothing in that to make anyone sad. Her sympathy for Thomas waned considerably when they moved along to the games. William had a go at the try your strength, but didn't get much more than halfway up the tower. Thomas naturally made a show of handing William his coat, strutted over, and rang the bell, leaving William clenching his teeth in humiliation. It was a bit funny, though, seeing Thomas's face when, instead of awarding him the cigar he expected as a prize, the stall-keeper presented her with an artificial flower. She told herself she shouldn't laugh. It wasn't likely he'd ever taken a girl to the fair before, was it? But it served him right for showing off. She wondered for a moment if she ought to give the flower to Daisy, who would appreciate it more than she would, but decided it would only add to William's humiliation, and tucked the stem behind her ear. At the coconut shy, she and Daisy had a go as well. With all 4 of them tossing the wooden balls at once, it wasn't quite as obvious that Thomas was responsible for their sole success. He managed not to crow about it either, sharing out the coconut between them. Anna wrapped a piece of her portion in her clean handkerchief, thinking to share it with Mr. Bates. They munched on it as they watched a juggler. She managed not to crow when Thomas, trying for the hat trick of funfair games, tried and failed to find the lady. William had won that one by keeping his penny in his pocket.
"That was fun, wasn't it?"
Daisy said as they turned for home. "It was," William said, barely tripping over his tongue at all. "We should do it again."
"It'll be a long time before the fair comes back, won't it?"
she asked. Thomas opened his mouth to explain that William had been alluding to the pleasure of her company, but subsided, surprising himself when Anna pressed his arm and whispered, "Don't." He'd been a bit angry and embarrassed, though he thought he'd managed not to show it, when Anna pretended to think he was asking her to go with him. At least he was very nearly almost completely sure that she was pretending. He'd started playing the gallant in hopes of embarrassing her right back, but somewhere along the way he'd started to enjoy himself a bit. Just a bit. There wasn't anything in it, of course, but there was a certain advantage to the way they'd ended up paired off. Usually, when the servants did anything as a group, he was hanging round the edges without anyone in particular to talk to, unless O'Brien happened to be there. And he felt queerly proud of himself, realizing, belatedly, at the Try Your Strength stall, that no one watching had any idea that he was only pretending and took him for a man walking out with a girl. On balance, he wasn't sure that he wouldn't rather have had the cigar, but still, there was something in it. Probably any number of people had looked at them and thought of their own courting days, admiring the handsome couple.
"Did you have a nice time?"
Anna asked, once they'd walked a bit more. "I did, rather," he admitted. "Don't tell anyone."
She huffed. "You're more fun to be around when you aren't trying to pretend you're above it all."
He gave her a sardonic look and said archly, "I am above it all."
"No, you aren't," she said quite seriously. "You're the same as the rest of us."
If only that were true. "I'm really not," she sighed, seeming about to say something, but chose not to. They let themselves in quietly, Thomas locking the door behind them. When they reached the place where the men and women went their separate ways, and after they'd seen that Daisy and William parted with no funny business, Anna rose up on her toes and quickly, chastely, kissed his cheek. She was gone up the woman's staircase before Thomas had quite decided how to react. He was still a little bemused when he'd made his way up to the men's corridor, and so was taken completely by surprise when Mr. Bates, coming out of the bathroom, loomed up in front of him. Thomas was startled enough to take a step backwards, so that he was up against the wall. Bates pressed in, not quite laying hands on him, but clearly trying to make a point of his greater bulk.
What do you think you're playing at?
I beg your pardon? Thomas asked.
With Anna.
Thomas shrugged slightly. What's it to you? The question was more or less genuine. It wasn't Bates's place to concern himself with a female staff.
She's a decent woman, and she deserves better than to be toyed with as one of your nasty little schemes.
Oh, so it's like that, is it? Thomas was surprised he hadn't noticed before.
I really don't know what you're talking about.
With that, Bates did lay hands on him, shoving him up against the wall hard enough to thump the back of his head.
Now listen here, you filthy little rat!
Before he could say just what it was he wanted Thomas to listen to, William's door creaked open and Thomas saw a flutter of movement through the gap. Realizing they were being watched, Bates released him with another shove and muttered,
"Just keep your hands off her,"
before disappearing into his own room, shutting the door emphatically. Shaking his head, Thomas pushed off the wall and went into his room. He was by the window having a calming cigarette when there was a tap at the door.
"What?"
he demanded, careful to keep any hint of worry out of his voice. If Bates was willing to manhandle and threaten him in the corridor, he wasn't sure what he'd do in the relative privacy of Thomas's room. But it was William who came in, wearing his undershirt and a confused expression.
"What was that about?"
Thomas took a slow drag on his cigarette, considering his answer. If he told William that Bates fancied Anna, the whole house would know by lunchtime. It might be entertaining, but on balance, he thought he'd rather keep it in reserve. With a casual shrug, he replied,
"You'd have to ask him. Should I go get Mr. Carson?"
For a moment, Thomas couldn't imagine why, until he realized that if anyone had shoved William up against a wall, Carson would probably do something about it.
"Better not,"
he said, flicking ash out the window. "No harm done, and I doubt Bates likes talebearers any more than Carson does."
"I guess not,"
William agreed, taking a few more steps into the room.
"I thought he seemed so nice."
"Carson?"
"Mr. Bates. I hope he doesn't decide he's got to quarrel with me."
If William was just a little bit cleverer, he'd come to the conclusion that Thomas had had it coming to him, even though on this particular occasion he hadn't. Thomas thought of several withering ways to point that out, but why spoil having someone take his side for a change?
"I doubt he will. He seems to like you."
"Everyone does." William turned to go, finally, but then turned back.
"I want to thank you for fixing things with Mr. Carson so Daisy and I could have a proper date. I'm not sure you did it to be nice exactly, but it was, just the same."
He nodded, as if he'd just settled something. What the heck was he supposed to do with that? Taking another drag on his cigarette, he stubbed it out and said, "Go to bed, William." William went. The next morning, at breakfast, Bates was pleased to see that Thomas was no longer paying any particular attention to Anna. He was less pleased to see that when they were all standing up afterwards, she took his arm and said a private word or two in his ear. It was all very well to warn Thomas off, but what if Anna had her feelings hurt by his disregard? Well, it would have happened sooner or later, whether Bates had said anything to Thomas or not. Still, he was in something of a brown study when he went up to dress Lord Grantham, enough so that his lordship noticed and asked if something was troubling him.
He shook his head. "Just a bit of downstairs intrigue, my lord. Thomas is at the centre of it, of course."
Grantham looked sharply at him.
"What sort of intrigue?"
Bates hesitated over what to say.
"You'll have heard that a group of the younger staff went to the fair last evening."
Grantham nodded.
"Carson mentioned it?" William asked the kitchen maid, Daisy, to walk with him particularly. I suppose Thomas couldn't stand to see William have a prize that he didn't, so he asked one of the housemaids.
Grantham turned back to the window, adjusting his tie.
"He likes to show off. I wouldn't worry about it."
Naturally he wouldn't, but he didn't know Anna like Bates did. He tried again.
"I just don't like to see him toying with her finer feelings when he's so slimy."
Now, Grantham turned to face him.
"I'm surprised at you,"
he said in a tone of mild reproof.
"You never had a problem with Walcott and Granby."
The two men's romance had been an open secret in their regiment. In fact, Bates had had a problem with them at first, but he'd come to see that there was something good and pure in their affection for one another.
I'm afraid I don't see that Thomas has much in common with Wolcott and Granby, my lord. They were both decent and honourable men.
Grantham opened his mouth, then closed it again.
Believe it or not, Thomas has shown he can be relied on in a crunch.
He turned back to the mirror.
I'm not saying I wasn't surprised, mind you, but he has. Very good, my lord,
Bates said. Returning downstairs, he decided that he'd no choice but to speak to Anna herself. He hated to broach the sordid matter with her, but if the little creep could pull the wool over Lord Grantham's eyes, he could fool anyone. He was glad to find her alone in the boot room, polishing a pair of shoes that must have belonged to one of the young ladies. Opening the subject was easy enough.
How was your evening at the fair?
He asked, taking a pair of Lord Grantham's shoes from where the boot boy had left them. It was fun, she said. I think Daisy's coming round to William a bit. Oh, and Thomas wanted a coconut. I saved you a piece, but I don't have it with me.
That's very kind.
He hesitated.
About Thomas.
She paused in her polishing and raised her eyebrows. Yes?
I hope that you don't have serious feelings for him, because you won't be able to return them. I can't say why, as it isn't my secret to tell, but it isn't any fault in you.
Anna seemed to be struggling not to smile. Is this... Hang on. She went over and pushed the door nearly closed. Is this about him being safe in taxis?
Yes, I believe it is.
He wasn't familiar with the expression, but he wasn't sure what else it could mean.
You know, then.
She nodded. Miss Patmore's trying to let Daisy in on it, but she won't take a hint. Bates stared at her in surprise.
How many of the women's staff know about his...
Quite a few of us. It doesn't take long to notice that he only flirts with girls when he wants someone to see him doing it, and he's not as subtle as he thinks he is when a handsome man comes into view. She smiled now. It's kind of you to be concerned, but if I get my heart broken, it won't be Thomas Barrow who does it.
Good,
Bates said vaguely. He wanted to add that he didn't like the idea of her having her heart broken, but he couldn't say a thing like that, not if she meant what he thought she did. And even if there's nothing in it, there's something enjoyable about going round the fair on a man's arm. Bates quashed a stab of jealousy and said lightly,
Even when it's Thomas.
He isn't always awful. Quite a bit of the time, but... She shrugged. As difficult as it is to live with him, it must be even harder to be him.
I hadn't thought of it quite that way,
Bates admitted. It was a sign of her pure and generous heart, he thought, that Anna would think of it that way. It isn't as though he confides in me, she said, or in anyone except maybe Miss O'Brien, but I think of Lady Mary and how... She looked over at the door, making sure that their conversation was still private. When she's at her most awful, it's usually because she's just had it rubbed in her face that she can never be his lordship's heir, just because she's a woman. It makes her so angry, and she takes it out on Lady Edith or Mr. Matthew, even though they've nothing to do with it.
Lady Mary's always kind to us,
Bates pointed out, slightly unsettled by the comparison between his lordship's darling daughter and the odious Thomas. All the more so because he could see why she drew it.
The servants, I mean.
We're not a threat to her, she considered. I suppose everyone's a threat to Thomas. I've heard they can go to prison for it, men like that. There was a hint of a question in her tone, and Bates confirmed.
They can.
But in his experience, they usually weren't.
But mainly if someone turns them in. He'd have less to fear on that score if he weren't so spiteful. We had some like that in our regiment when I was in the service. We all turned a blind eye because they were decent enough blokes otherwise.
He does make things harder for himself. She shook her head and turned her attention back to the shoe for a moment. He's not all bad, though, and he's almost seemed to make an effort lately. Giving the shoe a final swipe of the cloth, she smiled up at him and said, I'd best take these up. She left. Well, if the two people in the house whose good opinion he most cherished said that Thomas wasn't as bad as he seemed, he supposed there was nothing for it but to try and find the good they saw in him. Once they cleared the upstairs breakfast, Thomas evaded Carson's eagle eye and nipped out into the courtyard for a smoke. O'Brien was there, halfway through his cigarette. Taking his handkerchief out of his pocket, he handed it to her, saying,
Oh, here.
What do I want for this?
It's part of the coconut I won at the fair,
He explained. He'd meant it as a peace offering.
And what do I want with it?
She repeated.
Stung, he retorted. If you don't, I'll have it back.
He reached for it, but she held it away.
So you enjoyed it, did you? Bowing Anne around the fair. We were only keeping an eye on William and Daisy, as you know.
He changed the subject.
Turns out someone does fancy her, though.
How exciting, she said dryly.
You'll never guess who. Mr. Bates,
she answered.
Did you only just figure it out?
Thomas was reminded of what Anna had said about him being more fun when he wasn't trying to be above it all. Miss O'Brien wasn't exactly being much fun at the moment.
It'll give us all something new to talk about, at least.
Are you going to make a play for her, then? Or are you more scared of him than you are of William? He was, but he only said,
She wouldn't fall for it. I'm surprised even Daisy would, the way you carry on.
Thomas glanced over at her sharply. Until that moment, it had just been the exchange of barbs that had become usual for them since Pamuk. But this was the glass come out and no mistake.
What do you mean?
Only that you're not as much of a mystery to the fair sex as you think you are. Don't get your petticoats in a knot. With that, Thomas would have jabbed directly for one of her most vulnerable spots. If he only knew what they were. It occurred to him that while she quite encouraged him to confide in her, at least she had before, in return she'd only told him other people's secrets. Finally, after a long enough deliberation that she must have known she'd gotten to him, he said,
You can make a play for Bates yourself if you wanted to spoil it for them.
She scoffed.
As though I would. I imagine you're too old for him anyway.
It was a shot in the dark. Most women were sensitive about their ages, but he thought he must have scored at least a tap. She dropped her cigarette and strode off, saying,
I don't know why I ever bothered with you.
He wasn't sure why he'd bothered with her either, except that he did know she was the only one who'd give him the time of day, and she'd taken his handkerchief with her.
Mr. Carson?
William had deliberated for most of the morning over whether to approach Mr. Carson or not. In the end, it was the way that Mr. Bates glared at Thomas over the lunch table that convinced him he ought. But now that he'd bearded the dragon in his pantry, he was losing his nerve.
There's something I'm not sure if I ought to tell you. I don't like to bet tales, only you did say I was to come to you if there was anything concerning about Thomas.
Shut the door,
Mr. Carson said. William did so.
What happened?
Last night, after we got back from the fair,
William began and then hesitated.
Yes?
I'd just gone up to my room, and I heard a bit of a commotion in the corridor. I looked out, and Mr. Bates had Thomas shoved up against the wall.
Mr. Carson sat up even straighter, and his eyes widened.
Mr. Bates did?
Yes, it was threatening him and calling him all sorts of nasty names.
Warming to his story, William went on.
He took off when he saw me, and Thomas said he were all right. I went and asked him if he wanted me to get you, but the look on his face, I'd have been terrified if it were me.
On Mr. Bates's face?
William nodded.
It wasn't like how they butt heads normally. I can't really explain it. He weren't shouting or foaming at the mouth or nothing like that, but I just felt...
You were afraid for Thomas?
Mr. Carson sounded skeptical.
I was.
He hesitated, struggling for a way to put it into words.
I used to look after the horses on my father's farm, you know, and usually when one of them's upset he'll stamp his feet and twitch his tail, and you know you had better watch out. But the really mean ones don't give you any warning, just a look in their eye when the next thing they're going to do is hurt you. And that's what I thought of when I saw the look on Mr. Bates's face.
He shook his head.
I might have been wrong, and it was just a scuffle, but...
But you don't think that's all it was?
No, Mr. Carson. If I did, I wouldn't have bothered you with it.
You were right to tell me if you found it so worrying. We can't have a violent man in the house. I don't suppose you have any idea what Thomas may have done to provoke this outburst?
William shook his head.
I don't see how we could have done anything. Mr. Bates didn't go along to the fair.
What about earlier?
Reviewing the events of the day, William shook his head.
The only time I remember them talking is when Mr. Bates was encouraging me to speak up to Daisy, and Thomas was teasing me about it.
Mr. Carson raised an eyebrow at that, and William added,
Just in the way he always does. And when we were at the fair, he was almost nice.
For all his showing off, he hadn't actually come between them.
For him, at least.
Mr. Carson still looked worried, but said,
I'm glad to hear that.
William was emboldened to continue.
If it was something earlier in the day, something that Thomas did to provoke him, isn't that almost worse than if he just lost his temper in the moment? It would mean he was lying in wait for him.
Mr. Carson shook his head, but not as though he were disagreeing with what William had said.
Let's not get ahead of the facts. Leave the matter to me, and I hope I don't need to tell you not to gossip about it. No, Mr. Carson,
He agreed.
And I believe you are on duty in the hall this afternoon.
He was, and when he got there, Thomas said, Where have you been? In a way that made William regret for a moment sticking up for him. He mumbled some sort of excuse, knowing better than to say he'd been talking to Mr. Carson. Thomas would want to know why.
Well, I've been covering for you since lunch.
He spoke as if it had been hours instead of, at the most, 10 minutes, in which it was hard to imagine he had anything more important planned than smoking in the courtyard.
But William just said, I'm sorry, but I'm here now.
See that you are, Thomas said, and strutted off.